So, I am an associate professor of literature and critical race, gender, and culture studies here at AU. And it is my distinct pleasure to moderate this panel today. And I have to say that I am just super excited to ask questions and to have conversation with all of these brilliant students and with our colleague Jeff Middents as well, all of whom wrote really beautiful papers. And for those of you that maybe didn't ask a question on the Google document, if you have questions as they arise, why don't you just go ahead and post them in the chat and I can kind of pull them out as the conversation evolves, and we can kind of keep the conversation rolling that way. So at this time, I thought maybe I would introduce our panelists, and we have with us today Hannah Devito, Talia Marshall, Jeffrey Middents, and Ames Jewart. I'm going to call on them individually to say a couple words about themselves, and then we can get right into our Q&A, and I'll ask a question to kind of get us going. But please, if you do have follow-ups or things that you want to intervene with, raise your hand, put something in the chat. Again, we want to have this be as conversational as we possibly can. So with that, Hannah, do you want to say a couple words about yourself, and we'll just go from there.
Hello, I'm Hannah Devito. I apologize if I sound a little weird. I've been sick. I am a senior and I'm graduating this semester, so that's super exciting. And I really enjoy literature. That is my major. Is there anything else I should add?
No, that's great. Thank you.
Thanks, you.
Hannah. Okay, Carla couldn't make it, so Talia.
Hi, I'm Talia. I'm a junior and I'm double majoring in Lit and American Studies with a WGSS minor. I think that's it.
Awesome. Jeff, I'm going to call on you last. Ames, would you say a couple words?
Hi, everybody. I'm Ames. I'm a senior lit major on the transcultural studies track, and I'm double minoring in French and teaching English to speakers of other languages.
Okay, Jeff. No sound, Jeff. There you go. You're back. Nope. It came on for a second. Now it's off again. Okay. While Jeff's coming back, why don't we just start the conversation? And there was a Google Doc that you all can reference. And I would like to kick things off today by asking a question. David Pike was really good about anticipating and kind of replicating a lot of the questions that I had. So I'm going to ask a question that David posed to the panel. And this is for Hannah, but please, other panelists chime in. So David says, thank you for this rich and thoughtful presentation. I was wondering if you could speak more about the future you locate in the middle of the trilingual Venn diagram. Is the future identical in the world where Machina works as a switchboard operator, and in the world of migrants in which much of the book takes place? How are the different locations she finds herself in interconnected, as with the infrastructure you mentioned? And how do they differ from one another?
I will start with that. Thank you for your question. For me, when I was trying to imagine this, I thought the future was an abstract space where the past becomes pretty much integrated. Sorry, I have some notes. I'm going to make it sound better. The past, such as Makina's life as a switchboard operator and the various languages, converge to create an integrated future. So it is the new hybrid languages, as the migrants are increasingly connected and related to one another through these languages. That is the future that I'm imagining. It's hopefully identical for the two different worlds, but I think that there's a lot of disconnect with the cultures. So I don't necessarily think they would be perfectly identical, but either way, it's the idea that everything's going to become hybridized and become the new world instead of the old. And then the different locations she finds herself in are interconnected. such as the letters, the switchboard, and eventually cell phones. They differ from one another because Makina's origin, the South, relies on people to transport the messages through the switchboard and the letters, and then the North erases the people and focuses on technology with this disruptive cellular devices. Yet there are still people like Makina's brother who utilizes letters to build a repertoire between the North and South and try to hybridize that communication.
Can I ask a follow-up, Hannah? Because I was really interested in this question as well. And I'm curious, not just about the kind of temporal aspects of infrastructure that you're thinking about, but about the way that you're understanding infrastructure itself. Because when I think about infrastructure or that word, I often think about like roads and bridges and that kind of stuff. And you know, Jeff kind of talks about this in his video essay that he presented. So I'm just curious about, like, infrastructure seems like something really durable, but the case you seem to be making is about a kind of evolving hybridity and adaptation, to use the terms that Carla used in her presentation. So I'm curious about how you're thinking about infrastructure, and then how it can be adapted, or how we see Herrera adapting it in the novel.
Yeah, I see infrastructure as methods for communication. So the letters, the switchboard, and the cell phones are those methods for communication. They are the infrastructure that are put into place so that the community can be connected. And with that, sorry, could you repeat the second part of the question? I was focusing too much on defining that.
Yeah. So I'm curious about like the adaptability of infrastructure. So how is it adaptable? And where do you see that kind of operating here?
I think it's adaptable in the way that the letters are consistent, and it doesn't matter whether it's transported by a person. It does when you're from the South in the novel, but once you get to the North, for example, Makina's brother, he just sends the letters through the post. And so it's adaptable in the way that each method works, but the cultural location matters, especially for the cell phones, in the way that the North has completely integrated the cell phones into their life. And Makina constantly comments on how they're disruptive and beeping and bothering people, yet the South, they haven't adapted to that. They don't have the cell towers, and that would be a way they would form that connection. But without that, the physical infrastructure of cell towers, they cannot even connect with the cell phones.
Thank you so much. And if other panelists want to jump in, please do.
I was going to say that the infrastructure in the little town is, of course, Makina. Like there's a way of, you know, because as a switchboard operator, but she also can translate both culturally and linguistically in ways that the other infrastructure can't or doesn't. Do you think of, well, this is one thing, and I'm only thinking about this right now, that no one in any of the panels has talked about Makina's name and how close it is to machine. The Spanish for machine as máquina. Hannah, do you think of Makina as infrastructure herself? Like, or is that horrifying to think? I mean, you know, given that, you know, we're not dealing with, we don't want to talk about people that way.
I think yes, especially because she operates as a translator for multiple people throughout the novel. One of my sources specifically talked about how when you're a translator, you act as the infrastructure to connect people to opportunities. For example, in the source I'm talking about, I think her name was Romero, she discusses how when she was very young, what a fellow member of her community wanted to become a barber, but the entrance exam for the barbership, for the barber license, I should say, that was completely in English. So the person couldn't understand it whatsoever. And this, the translator operated as a form of infrastructure so that he could physically take the exam. And she translated the whole thing for him.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Hannah. So I see a question in the chat from Marianne. Marianne, do you want to just ask your question, or do you would you rather that I read it?
I'm happy to, but can I ask a different question? Because that one is
Sure.
just sort of a general question. But I actually was just writing one about this, what we were just talking about. So one of my favorite scenes in the novel is the one when Makina is translating for a couple that's fighting, and she says, oh, what he means is this, and then the woman is able to respond. I loved that. I just thought that was so incredibly like beautiful and human. And I guess I'm saying human because of Jeff's point about Makina as a machine. It's very, very hard. I'm very uncomfortable thinking of her role in that situation as infrastructure because it seems so human, so just so uniquely alive and not responding in a rote way. So I guess, yeah, in light of like, maybe Hannah, you could just, by the way, I loved it was very interesting. It's very good. So yeah, just like more on that and the way it might complicate thinking about Makina as infrastructure.
I know that this is kind of unrelated, but I want to bring into the idea the angel of the house, just because I think it relates somewhat from the 1800s. With that idea, it was that women are supposed to be the source of morality within the generalization or the general trend of industrialization. And with that, I think that maybe Makina herself operates as the pinpoint or the beacon point for morality throughout the novel, especially in that situation where she's translating their complex feelings and making them better understand one another.
Yeah, right. But like, still, she seems so humane and so not like infrastructure,
Although
Like,
I
are
will
you saying that the angel in the house is infrastructure?
No, I'm just saying that she is a beacon point of morality. I'm not necessarily saying infrastructure is related to that.
Right.
I was just trying to say that maybe that's why she's experienced like that, as well as maybe she's the median point between infrastructure and humanity, because she constantly is translating messages that are beneficial to other people. For example, the boys who were almost taken advantage of by the Anglo men. And with that takes a certain amount of humanity to even engage in that, because she, as a machine, she wouldn't be involved in that.
Yeah.
Well, she might be a different kind of machine, right? So, the thing that I'm thinking of as we're having this conversation is that we treat migrants from Mexico as if they are just laboring machines in many ways, right? And in her crossing the border, and especially I'm thinking about the scene with the policeman towards the end of the novel where, these men are utterly dehumanized, right? And she's able to bring a kind of humanization, right? But I'm also thinking about things like machine learning, right? Which may in some ways replace the translator, in like very near futures. So there are ways in which like machines can operate in I'm not making a case for her as a machine. I'm thinking about the ways in which, she acts in mechanical ways, but also is trying to disrupt what it means to be a certain kind of machine. So, or how she's mechanized by her life on the other side of the border. Jeff's right that these spaces aren't identified, so I don't want to refer to it as the United States and Mexico, but it seems to be places like that. Okay, we have a couple hands up. So Talia and then Lily.
Yeah, also apologies, there's something happening outside my window, so I'll try to talk over it. But I wonder if maybe we don't see her as a machine and we see her as very human, because the entire novel is told like from a sympathetic perspective towards her. But I think to a certain extent, her community and the other characters in the novel do see her as a piece of infrastructure, because she's the translator, she's the switchboard operator. There's the scene with her boyfriend who's not her boyfriend. And I think he's one of the only people who sees her as more than just like someone to be used to get to his own, like their own means. Like she's the person who carries the message across the border. So not really sure where I'm going with that, but I feel like part of the reason why we see her as so human is because we see inside of her and not just the utility she has to her community.
And thanks for that, Talia. Lily?
Yeah, I just wanted to add on to the conversation about the human non-human. It feels like we're having this dialectical really conversation about the human and non-human. It seems like this conversation is stretching, right, the parameters of humanness. And I think that's wonderful, right, that it signifies a little differently. And I actually want to be a bridge myself to then call in David Pike to kind of say more about the people as infrastructure, right? And I think that is really fascinating, right, because there are kind of folks that are doing work in infrastructure that is trying to redefine the parameters of peoplehood as opposed to masshood, right? Like people are not masses, right? If we're thinking through dialectical humanism, right? That then the human itself as a category needs to be stretched beyond other colonial concepts of utility. And so this is where I want myself to be a bridge infrastructure, right? To call in David Pike. Can you come in and say more?
Yeah, actually, I will then also defer to Lindsey, who will know more about this than I do, because this is more her field, and I very likely picked up that concept from her at some point. So I suppose I would put it more, especially in terms of the way Hannah was talking about that, and the way you mentioned technology is, of course, not non-human, because humans build technology, humans design technology, and so technology actually has human relations built into it, even if we don't see them. So one way of thinking about this might be to think about the ways that Herrera, in a sense, does a bridge, moves back and forth, that he's breaking down what you call the dialectic, Lily, or actually making the dialectic feel dialectical. So that might be one way of thinking about it, but also to remember that infrastructure is neither negative nor positive. In many cases, infrastructure keeps people alive, especially in places where infrastructure doesn't work very well. So I think it's really important to, again, to think about that. The follow-up question I asked then might be a way of thinking of, so how does Herrera ask us to, what ways does he give us to evaluate how we're meant to position ourselves in terms of that infrastructure? And this, maybe I can push this back to the panelists. Can you think of ways in which, I mean, Makina, I think most of us are thinking of very much as a positive character. So does that then give us the tools to think about infrastructure as sometimes working well and sometimes not working well, as opposed to thinking about it as when either alienating or non-alienating? Can we think about, well, when does it function? When does it not function? When are the times when it works? When are the times when it breaks down? And how does that work within the space of the novel?
Panelists?
I can go since I focused a lot on infrastructure. I hate to keep going back to the example of the cell phone tower, but I feel like that really emphasizes when the infrastructure breaks down. And when we're using humans as infrastructure, I'm sorry to use this example again, but the bus boys really emphasizes that to me, because the Anglo men, they're choosing not to connect with these boys and to take advantage of them. And in that way, the infrastructure has kind of failed to provide these boys the opportunities to communicate. And I think that it also just relates overall to how with languages, we need to be more, I guess, culpable trying to understand them and trying to build that repertoire, because we can't operate as infrastructure ourselves and help each other unless we have the multilingual capability.
You know, I'll throw my piece actually in some ways is that dealing with the flip side of infrastructure, and that I was actually trying to deal with landscape. But also my piece is sort of disguising the fact that I kind of agree with Hannah that like there is a lot going on with infrastructure, or with the urban, with I've disguised through the piece that it seems like it's going to be something about the something more natural. Ames will probably disagree with me on this, which which will be fun. But that there is that actually the urban and the sort of more emphasis on infrastructure actually brings this different dynamic out of this. If I can pull in, you know, another panelist's one, this morning I was just looking at I finally got to panel 3, and Alejandra's piece, which it tends to look at sinkholes and how infrastructure in particular turns into the natural by failing. also is, and of course, I'm falling into the same dialectic that Lily has warned us not to go into. Although maybe it's not. Maybe this is how they're folding into one another. Actually, from the very beginning, maybe how the entrance. A lot of the pieces today, we've all focused on the exit, and very few of them have focused on the entrance. But maybe the entrance is like sort of Lily's warning that this is like actually folded into one another more. And I invite Ames to actually like totally shoot all of this down as also like.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And I was trying to think through like your video, especially because I think Professor Pike wrote a question that was like, think about someone's video. Anyway, but I was thinking about it too, because I think so much of like an Indigenous relationship to like the earth is like critical. And the ways in which Herrera's emphasis on the urban and the way that Makina has to travel through it is sometimes is in way like a representation of the way that Indigenous people have been cut off from the earth, the same way that I talked about within my video. So I actually really liked yours, and I thought our pieces worked well together, because I think it illustrates the way that Makina, because she's so focused on her material survival, she doesn't have like, in many ways, like the privilege to think about the landscape and to think about the earth. And so I think our pieces actually work very well together, and I'm not going to try and shoot you down.
I see that Lindsay and Linda have their hands up.
Yeah, so I'll chime in a little bit about infrastructure and try and connect these comments, but I think it's I believe it's Abdul Malik Simone that's whose term is people as infrastructure. But one of the things that I think is cool to think about that that Hannah, I think your presentation brings to the fore, and then is like echoed in some of the others, is thinking about infrastructure. There was a PLMA issue a while back, and I can't remember now who the editors are, but talking about cities of the global south and infrastructure. And one of the things that struck me about that, and that I use then in my own work, is thinking about infrastructure and the play between surface and depth, and the play between what we see and what we don't see. So infrastructure, right, is roads, but it's also all the pipes that are underneath, or the fiber optics that are underneath, as much as it is, right, the cell phone towers and the internet. You know, it's all those kind of hidden underground, right, messy things. And obviously there's so much underground in this novel. And I think, I mean, maybe this is a question, but I mean, I think there's a way too of thinking about Makina's journey as also kind of playing with a different type of dialectics than Lily, but with the dialectics, or the play between what's hidden, what's buried, the surface, what's underneath, and what's visible. And I think in a lot of ways, her journey is hidden and underneath and buried. And then there's also all this stuff about infrastructure as connecting, right? And in so many, Jeff and I both teach film and globalization. I know you teach this novel in that course, but I teach Exit West by Mohsin Hamid. And there's also, right, a lot in that novel, which is very similar to this in a lot of ways, even though like tone and mood and plot are very, very different. But there's a lot about cell phones, but there's also a lot about prayer in that novel, and as prayer as a type of infrastructure and type of communication. And then also Dirty Pretty Things is another film that I think we both teach, which is kind of a lot about infrastructure. And there's this one moment in the film where two characters are sharing a space, and one is doing dishes and one is taking a shower. And I forget if she turns off like somehow the water is messed up, and she yells and she says, "Can't you see everything here is connected to everything else?" And that's sort of like the thesis of the film and the thesis of lit film and globalization in a way. But I love that it's a very ephemeral thing. I mean, it's a very sort of like global abstracting, but also very concrete. Like, you just messed up washing my dishes because you turned the water on. So there's a way in which, right, these hidden things, but then it's also about like the global organ trade. So so there's a way in which infrastructure is very material, very concrete, very much felt, I read about infrastructures of feelings, but also very much invisible and underground and buried. And I think that that tension plays out a lot in this novel as well. So I will stop there.
Go ahead, Linda.
My question is for Talia, and I wondered if maybe one of the ways that we can wiggle loose of this dialectic, or at least explore it further in terms of the human and the non-human, or humans used non-humanly, is to take up your point about Makina as an aspect of poetry. And I found your argument so compelling, so thoughtfully done, and I really thank you for it. But you seem to be saying at the end that thinking about her as that tail end of the Arabic poem, the couplet or the ending that in which a woman speaker often steps in and says goodbye, brings up the relation of identification and alienation. And I wish you would say more about that, because it strikes me that one way that we can complicate our finding of this dialectic between the human and the non-human is to see how many things, how many figures are contained within the figure of Makina. If she's a machine, or labor used as machine, if she's a switchboard, she's also a conduit, how richly wonderful it is that Herrera has tried out the myth of the underworld, sending down not a hero, but a conduit, right? And sort of see what happens then if the one who descends is not hero or pilgrim, but conduit, translator. And so I wondered if, right, so she's many, many things, including she's a poem, or she's the aspect of a poem. And I loved your sense that that he's playing there on the derivation of the word for stanza, which comes from Italian for room. So enough about that. But identification, alienation, if you'd say a little more about that.
Yeah, for the identification and alienation, I think I was thinking both about Makina and about the verb harchar. Sorry to move on from infrastructure to this, but because the word has been translated, it's been like to verse, it's been sort of alienated from its context of like the Arabic poetry origins. And then, but it's also a form of identification because Makina carries that form through her character and the way she behaves throughout the novel, and especially in that final passage that I highlighted in the presentation.
So I'd like to just kind of press on this question of form and formal innovation a little bit, in part because I kind of move in more social sciencey circles these days, so I don't get to talk about form as much, but also because there were a whole bunch of questions both in the Google Doc and I think that you raised, Talia, in your presentation that revolve around questions of form. And I'm going to kind of paraphrase because there were a couple questions from David and Sandra. Please chime in, the two of you as well, that are asking, in a sense, a question that I have, which has to do with some of the stakes or the motivations behind invoking this particular form, right, the karja. And, you know, on the one hand, it's super interesting that, you know, such a kind of ancient form is being invoked. On the other, if in fact this is a novel, as Ames is making the case for, that that is trying to work on a different kind of cartography, one that is not oriented around Eurocentrism. Like, I'm curious about the stakes of going back to that kind of Eurocentric form. And I'm not being critical per se, I'm persuadable on this point, but I'm interested in like what it means to kind of invoke this form and what it might indicate. And just to sort of flesh out my question a little bit, like what I'm interested most in is that formal innovation is often a sign that older narratives aren't working. So, so what is it about the content that needs to be reaccommodated by this formal innovation?
Yeah, so to your point about why it's from like the Spanish Arabic as opposed to like indigenous Mexican origins, I honestly don't know. I didn't consider that until I saw your question this morning. And I think that's a really good question that I don't have an answer for. I don't know very much about the Spanish language. I haven't taken Spanish since high school, but it could possibly be a commentary on the way that the Spanish language colonized Mexico or something like that. But I don't really know. If someone knows more about Spanish, they're welcome to chime in. And then the second part of the question about like formal innovation. I was talking yesterday in Sandra Beasley's poetry workshop. We were talking about this kind of inside, but we were talking about the golden shovel and how it started as like a nonce form. That was the first time I heard the word nonce, and now I really like it. So I was thinking about the verb harchar as like a nonce verb. I'm not sure if I'm using the word nonce correctly, and how as of right now, it's only really being used in the book, but like it's probably being innovated into like as language evolves and the form like moves outside of the novel and becomes like the verb becomes more of a verb that's used colloquially as opposed to just in the novel. And I think it's really interesting to think about how language evolves and the way that the novel has the power to cause the evolution of language, especially when you're making up an entire word that no one's heard of and you have to like really dig to figure out where it's coming from.
So Talia, can I just jump in and ask you a question about your own research process? When did you realize this connection to this much older form and then come to trace it at work at the end of the novel?
So originally I wanted to talk about forms from Caroline Levine and talk about the border as a form, but then I reread the novel and I was like, this isn't really that much about the border. And I was thinking about language as a form. So I was looking up information about just language in the novel, and I came across someone, or I was like reading the translator's note and I was like, oh, it's a verse, that's so interesting. So I just looked up the word harchar to see what it even meant because I'd never heard it before. And the only references to harchar on Google that I could find were people trying to figure out what it meant because they'd read this book. So then I dug some more and I found like the Karja, and then dug more into the Karja, and I was like, wait, Makina is the Karja of the novel because she fits all of these criteria that I've come across. And then I wanted to choose a passage to analyze for my piece. And since I had recently reread the book, the last passage was in my mind, and I realized that it was sort of also the Karja of the novel, and that Makina was enacting like the Herrera and Harcha as opposed to the Karja, like the medieval Karja, and how the two forms interacted.
Super fascinating. So Jeff asked a question in the chat about a clarification of nonce words, and then after that, Marianne has a question.
Yeah, so Sandra, I think you're here. If you want to jump in if I'm incorrect, or you can just go if you want. Oh, okay. So from my understanding, a nonce form of poetry is like a one-off, like the first time someone does it. So with the Golden Shovel, I forget the name of the poet who did the first Golden Shovel, but he was just like, I'm going to do this poem called The Golden Shovel. And then people were really, or this one poetry professor, again, I forget his name, or a poetry teacher in Chicago public schools really liked it and was assigning Golden Shovels to his students, which led to an anthology. And now it's like out of high school, other people are doing it as well. So it's becoming like a contemporary form, but a nonce form is just like the first time someone does it and they don't really think much of it often, but then it has the potential to become a much bigger sort of movement thing.
Okay, Marianne and then Sandra.
Sandra, why don't you go first?
Sure, only just because it dovetails. Thank you. That was a great description, Talia, of nonce. So just to codify, when we're talking about received forms, I talk of nonce forms, which begins as single poet. So for example, Kim Adonicio's take on the sonnets, which she calls Vassananitios, and then contemporary as if more poets dialogue with it in the immediate adjacent generation, traditional as if it starts to jump generations. So nonce to contemporary to traditional, all types of received forms. And I just wanted to mention that I love, and there's a little bit of great dialogue in the chat about this, but I love the idea that sometimes when a form evolves, it's not so much about answering a problem that has arisen within the form, but cross-pollination across cultures. And the comparable example that I would mention is sestinas. Sestinas are a 12th century troubadour form. And then for a long time, certainly in 20th century Western poetics, the sestina was being taught with an expectation that the lines should be iambic pentameter. I actually remember Henry Taylor saying he would not read any sestina draft brought to workshop unless it was in iambic pentameter, which is interesting because if you think back to French, it makes no sense that iambic pentameter would be organic to the form. You can't do iambic pentameter in French. So, not in a consistent, sustained way. So it's just an example of as the sestina actually moved to British and became kind of entrenched in the received formal traditions of England, the presumption was in order to be integral and to have integrity as a form, it needed to be an iambic pentameter.
So I don't want to change directions. I love where that was going. My question is, and if anyone wants to pick up on that, I can wait. Okay. So Talia, first of all, I also loved your presentation. I just found it wonderful and sensitive and original and just so illuminating. It was so interesting. But while you were talking, you mentioned you had been thinking about the idea of language as form, and that brought me back to the question that I typed like at the beginning of this discussion. And I thought it might be, I would like to ask you, because I was very confused and struck by the names H and W and the way that they're spelled out instead of being presented as letters. And I wanted to ask everybody, but maybe you have a thought about that since you have thought about language as form. So do you have a thought about that? Can you interpret, do you have an interpretation of that choice?
Yeah, I think I'll find exactly who the critic is who said this, but when I was first doing my research, I was looking at language as I was talking about and the names, like nomenclature in the novel, and how the only things in the novel that receive like a direct proper noun name are Makina, her mother, whose name I think her mother, and her brother, Chucho. And then their town is just like the little town, I forget exactly. And Mexico City is the Big Chilango. The United States is Gringolandia. And then Mr. HW, I forget exactly the letters they are, but I think that it's sort of connected to, I think Professor Middents talked about this in his presentation, but the like spare language that Herrera uses. So by just giving Makina, her mother, her brother, the proper like full names, we're just focusing on them, and then the rest of it kind of just falls around them. I'm not really sure if, Chucho is the one who crosses her over. So actually, I don't think her mother receives a name then. Yeah, I think her mother is just her mother.
It's Cora.
And everyone's described, yeah, oh yeah. So it's not her brother doesn't receive a name. It's just Cora, Chucho, and Makina. And everyone else is described in relation to Makina, which I think speaks to the centrality of her as like the Karja. The entire novel is sort of built around her.
Yeah, but what about so the H is just, you're just saying that that's part of the spareness? Like H and W and I forget the other one, but it's just.
That's a good point. I guess so. I didn't really think super deeply on why they just receive letters. I'm gonna try to find the piece of criticism I was reading.
Well, I mean, to me, like I'm familiar with letters. Like for example, Kafka uses K for a character. Mm-hmm. So I'm not unfamiliar with that. It was the spelling out of the letters that just, I was just so struck. I have no answer, but I was wondering if anyone has if not, I mean, maybe that's not something you have thought about, but like other people, like, anyone have a theory on that? Or a reaction?
Yeah, there's a couple things, you're mentioning it now, is perhaps ironically reminding me of a different short novel from Latin America, which uses all names, which is Garcia Marquez's Chronicle, The Death Foretold, which completely, like every single minor character gets a name entirely to implicate them in, spoiler, the death that is about to, that is going to occur. But the, and here, I think that it's, the distancing effect of the names, or the lack of names, really does go into effect to sort of like keep us like encircled around Makina. But I think it's a good point that you bring out, like if the letters are actually spelled out this way. I would, and I'm trying to think if this works for the rest of them, but for H, which is the most prominent one for us in English, the AITCH, spelled out in Spanish, that would be H, which would sound like harchar, actually. So there's a way in which, and it would look like actually on the page like that. I don't know how that works with the other letters. And it's funny right now, I know that one of them is W, and that is one of the funnier, funnier Spanish ones where each country does, it's either, doble U, W, there's all sorts of, and I don't remember which Spanish version Herrera uses for that in Spanish. Did anyone here read this in Spanish? I'm sad that Alejandro is not here too. Do you remember, David, if which version of W is in?
Which W.
It is W.
And I just checked it. I just checked to see if he said H as in the English, but it's H. It is H in the Spanish.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
David, your hand's up anyway, so you
yes,
keep going.
So go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I'm not very good at unpacking things that I say, so and I didn't want to get into a long conversation about allegory, but I was trying to unpack a few things about what I just posted about allegory, because that is what we're talking about now. Is we're sort of thinking about, do these characters mean more symbolically or as personifications than they do as embodied persons? And I was thinking that this theme of, are people embodied and placed within the Mexico-US space-time? Are they embodied and placed as people, or are they more moving through some kind of a symbolic realm, an underworld, a realm in which we're thinking of them more in terms of their symbolic meanings or their meanings within systems than as themselves as individuals? And so I was sort of putting that out as something to talk about during the day, as to to that tension, I think, which is what he's doing. And maybe one of the reasons he's spelling things out is to sort of make them a little bit more like people names and a little bit less like personifications, the way that I think Jeff is the only one that noticed Machina in embodied, within that name. So I wanted to sort of just notice that as a theme that came up in a lot of the presentations, and sort of think about that tension, which also feels like him pushing back against the typical genre of border narratives, which is some kind of neorealism, which is very much focused on the material specific physicality and individuality of each journey, and to think about, to go back to Levine's language, which has come up, what are the affordances of each of these ways of thinking about what's happening between the US and Mexico, what's happening at the border, what's happening within these systems.
So I actually want to sort of think about that question about border narratives and the kind of thematics and formal kind of stuff that accrues around them, because I'm starting, David, your question got me thinking about Urrea's The Devil's Highway, which is a text that is very compelling and interesting, and I think dialogues nicely with this one. And you're right that there are portions of that text that are oriented around like a kind of hyper realism designed to like literally evoke, the death by hyperthermia. In that novel, there's a famous chapter where he narrates it in the second person, and he says, this is what will happen to your body if you undergo death by hyperthermia. But there are also huge sections of that book, I don't even know what to call it, where there's like weird mythic fantasy stuff going on. There are like spiritual beings that appear. You know, the characters themselves have hallucinations of various types. And it seems to me that there are aspects of the experience of crossing the US-Mexico border that maybe can only be captured in kind of extra realist frames. And it does seem to me that this novel is working in similar ways, right? Around trying to get our heads around like the kind of dehumanization that occurs, right? Because to kind of return to that earlier point, there's a way in which, you know, like Makina's intention is to cross and then come back immediately, right? She's on an errand, but that's not what happens to her, right? And in fact, she's utterly transformed by this experience in ways that I think the novel is really ambivalent about in the end. So I'm just sort of talking through this, but I'm really interested in what the panelists have to think about this question, because I think part of the formal questions that people were asking are about more than the Karja, but also about other forms and the other ways in which, you know, there's a lot of like kind of weird genre experimentation that's going on. And I'll just say one more word, which is that was my first time reading this novel, I'm sort of ashamed to say. But when I picked it up, I said to my partner, I didn't know this was a gangster novel, right? Because like the first chapter in a way reads that way, right? And then it starts to rip on all these other, like, you know, so we start with this one thing and end in a really different place, right? Around this kind of descent into the underworld and all this stuff. So I'm going to stop talking. David, go ahead. You're muted, David.
David, you're muted.
I wanted to turn this to Ames. An indigenous cartography is in fact a symbolic cartography. The mapping is another way of being material. It is also it's both abstract and hyper-realist. But I wanted to talk about a symbolic topography and underworld is also in a sense an allegorical space, a symbolic space. So maybe you could talk about those different kinds of mapping in some of these terms.
I can try, yeah. And if I'm off I'm off on the wrong track, pull me back, because I'm not sure I entirely understand your question, but I think I get what you're getting at. Yeah, I was just thinking about the symbolic versus the material as well. And I think that's kind of the beauty of thinking about it through cartography, because cartography is both based on like the material reality of like there's a river here and there's a mountain here, but also so much like can be done, like symbolic work happens through mapping, which is what Fujikane talks about in her piece, and why I sort of pulled from it is that like colonialism and the settler colonial state is enforced and then propagates itself through the way that they divide the world and through like the inclusion of the border in and of itself. So yeah, I like that Herrera leaves it open, that it's both symbolic and material, because I think it can help us to see that like the symbolic and the material both matter in our world and that we can't understand the one without understanding the other. I don't know if that's an answer at all to your question.
Lily.
Thank you, Ames and David, for kind of making those connections. It's getting me really excited because I just came off of a panel on Fujikane's new work. And so I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that. We just read her introduction in one of my classes. So I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit more about this, because this kind of tension between the material and the symbolic, right? That kind of push and pull itself, the way she kind of thinks through that is through this question about abundance, right? Abundance as a form of, you know, that push and pull between the symbolic and the hypermaterial, hyperrealist, as a way that doesn't have to lead towards back into settler colonial infrastructure again, right? That doesn't have to go back, right? It can actually be different forms of accumulation, right? And so her way of thinking about aloha abundance is a way of thinking about kind of connection of the symbolic and the material that is centered around accumulation in ways in which is not back on the scarcity model of settler colonial capitalism, right? right? I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that, because it seems like your presentation kind of tries to kind of add these dimensions, right, of the ways in which we can think about cartography and the ways in which, we're thinking about, Lindsey talked about the immaterial material kind of push and pull of infrastructure here, right? That is revealing that if we go back to dialect, this is revealing the always already, right? That the underworld has always already been there. And that is Fujikane's idea of abundance, is that we can oscillate towards different models altogether, right? And we need to add dimensionality, not fall back on the two-dimensionality of scarcity, and because a huge part of that violence is epistemological, is the ways in which we are organizing knowledge, right? So it's both symbolic and hypermaterial in the ways in which we organize land and our relationship to that, right? I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that, because I really love that connection. Please.
Thank you. And once again, I'm going to say something, but tell me if this doesn't answer your question. But I wanted to tie it back to, I was thinking about our discussion of forms and Talia's piece on the Karja, and sort of thinking about the question, I can't remember who asked it, about like why, if Herrera is trying to sort of work within the frame of like indigeneity in Mexico and in the US, did he pull from like this Eurocentric form? And I was thinking about that too, because of all the references, the other pieces people have done on like connections to Orpheus and connections to Dante Inferno, that he's definitely still playing with all these different sort of colonial and Eurocentric forms. And I think it goes towards the abundance mindset, because I read it as what he's saying is that like, we can't go back, like colonization happened and the world is a different place, but we can't see it as like a scarcity of what we've lost, but instead of all these things that we've gained. And so he's pulling from the abundance of different sort of material and like literary forms that exist to then sort of articulate this new decolonial indigenous future that has to be grounded in like what has happened, and yes, what was lost, but also sort of the abundance of our world now. Is that an answer to your question?
Jeff, I see your hand.
Well, I'm thinking about all of this, and Ames's calling our attention to the cartography in particular, the making, the articulation of space as an ancient, form. I wonder if that's happening, if that's dovetailing actually with Talia's questions about the form as well. That, and actually to Marianne's question about this, because now I'm stuck on the names and how the names, like Harchar, like the parts in this book that are actually sort of jarring, and they're small elements that make us stop. And as you know, many people have mentioned, like Lisa Dillman's piece actually mentions how the translation is actually really good because this is happening in the Spanish also. But if those aren't the formal like elements that are actually delineating the very cartography that you're talking about, Ames, that it's sort of a meta textual way of addressing some of these things. Basically, I want Ames and Talia to sort of talk like at each other and celebrity deathmatch it.
I don't really have anything. I agree. I really liked that reading, and I wondered, Talia, if you sort of had any thoughts. I think I've talked a little bit. I really liked your piece, and I thought ours worked well together. If you had anything.
Yeah, I also really like your piece. I don't know. I don't think this is going to be as celebrity deathmatch as people want it to be, because I feel like just the way they interact is really interesting, because I think we're looking at two, like you're looking more at like the physical form and I'm looking more at like the literary form, and like they can coexist, I think, is what I'm thinking. I don't know what you're thinking.
No, I'm with you. I totally agree. I think that goes to, I think what I was talking about earlier, the fact that like both the material and the symbolic have such an important weight, and that we have to understand both of them. And so articulating the material through a literary form is also just really interesting, the way that those come together. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think I have anything to add. I feel like you said it you articulated it very well.
Well, I feel like we should ask Jeff a question because he has such a beautiful presentation. And incidentally, thank you, Jeff, for making me aware of the Begley film, which is just beautiful and mind exploding in so many ways. But I'm curious.
I mentioned in passing, by the way, before you get to your question,
Yeah.
that the Begley film, I'm shocked, has come up in so many presentations. It came up in Ames's, it came up in David's, who wasn't even aware that it's connected to this book. I'm just fascinated that that film has made its rounds, but sorry.
Yeah, no. It's going to make some more rounds because I feel like I need to talk about it as well. But I'm really interested in thinking about landscape and the kind of tensions that you present in your presentation around the urban versus what we might think of as more traditional kinds of landscapes. And I want to sort of think through the implications of thinking about these as discrete realms in some of the ways that you do. Because, like David Harvey, for example, says that there, are essentially no landscapes that are unnatural, right? That New York City, for example, is a natural landscape. And if we think about the space of human beings and the kinds of environments, I'm going to kind of twist this a little bit towards environmental terms, but thinking about environments as the spaces where we live, work, and play versus like that kind of out there wilderness thing. I'm curious about how we then might read the kind of lack of signifiers that you're pointing to, right? Because it is really striking that this is like not really a place in this novel, right? It's just sort of like a thing that's sort of out there, some sort of time space area. I don't know what to call it even. And in thinking through, like, maybe that's part of the question that I have that you kind of put your finger on in your presentation is like, how do we describe this space in this novel, this world, in terms that maybe exceed landscape or urban or that kind of, dichotomy?
I have like such a complicated and probably convoluted answer to that. There's a way in which, as I was thinking and getting into my piece, and it's informed in some ways, I put none of my, I'm a horrible student in that I did not provide my bibliography, at the end of the piece, basically because I was tired and couldn't edit anymore, and it was one more thing to type in. There's some ways, but it's informed a lot of, shockingly coming from me, it's informed by a lot of coming out of Mexican film history. It's one of the reasons that the Figueroa pieces come in, and that comes out of Charles Ramirez Berg's sort of looking at all of these connections that go back to Mexican revolutionary idea or connections to the landscape, particularly through muralists and all of these other things, which is interesting as you mentioned this, because those murals, which are often depicting things that are natural, are on the walls of buildings or in space on walls, which are almost necessarily urban. So you really do, and I hadn't thought about that particular connection at the time with this. To get to your question, though, in terms of these, what to do with the spacelessness, because I actually don't think that it's a lack of space. If anything, like Herrera's book is all about spaces. They're just not actual spaces. And if I can pull in the one of the presentations from later in the day, which is Fernanda Perez's piece, where she brings out the idea of the border situation. She's actually and calling, there's a way in which she doesn't want to look at the border as space, but as a situation. And oddly enough, I kind of want to turn that into the space that it's, ever that rather than being identifiable, it's still present and necessary. And this whole thing is getting very squishy, but it is, it's porous. Not porous is the wrong word, but malleable, I think is the word there, and sort of its unidentifiable nature, or ambiguously defined nature actually gives it the power in some ways. Does that make sense?
It does make sense, sort of, but it's okay, because it's a hard question, and I don't really expect that there would be an answer. But I do want to invite Ames, since she's thinking about cartography, because it seems like a map might be really useful in this space, right?
Yeah, I was thinking about that too, especially somebody's presentation later on in the day, it might have been Mara's, I can't remember, it talked about how because of the namelessness, like it could be taking place in any other place where there's a border. So I think they name like Burkina Faso and somewhere else. And so I think the namelessness in a way like allows Herrera to articulate the border situation beyond just the US-Mexico context, and to sort of make it, like we were talking about earlier, more allegorical and more symbolic of borders in general, while also still being like materially tied to the US-Mexico specifically through like those small things. And like the one time that he mentions that it's definitely Spanish. So it's an answer to that. I also think, I didn't talk about this in my presentation, but Fujikane specifically like defines cartography as like the way that humans relate to the earth. So I think it's turning from a very colonial, like, here's the line, this is this country, this is this country, this is where the border goes, and to just how, I think you were saying, like, environment is any place where humans live on this planet and make relationships with each other and with their environment. I don't know that that's an answer, but that's what I have.
Yeah, that's actually really helpful. And in thinking about that point, I think only about 1/3 of the border has, or the US-Mexico border has like a natural boundary, right? Which is the Rio Grande. And the rest of it is quite literally a line drawn in the sand, right? So, so there's a way in which there is a lot of porousness. I think that actually is the right word, Jeff. There's a lot of porousness, yeah. We have about a half an hour. If people would like to ask questions of the panelists in the session, we can do that, or I can ask another question from the Google Doc or the chat. Let me go to the Google Doc, and I feel like we haven't given Ames her due, so I want to ask a question from the Google Doc about it. So Cassidy asked a question. You mentioned that it is the Earth itself that decided that Maquina had a right to be on US land, but even while reclaiming this identity from a settler colonial state, Maquina uses the documents of the colonizers. I wonder if you examined at all the role of documents, immigration papers, maps, etc., in subversions of settler colonialism.
Yeah, so I hadn't thought about it until Cassidy asked her question, but then I did some thinking about it last night. And there were a couple things, but the first one is just that I think I talked in the first half of my piece about how the earth has been like subverted by settler colonialism and turned against like indigenous people. And so I sort of was reading through the ending where Maquina gets her documents as a way of then subverting the settler colonial structures by like reaffirming the earth and indigeneity through using those settler colonial structures. But then I also think it comes back to what I was talking about earlier, where like, because of the place we're in now, like settler colonialism like happened and the colonial systems are like inescapable in a way in our current moment. Like you can't get around them. Like Maquina needs the papers if she wants to be in the US. And so as a way of like her getting those documents, reaffirming her identity, but also as opening up this new indigenous future where now that she has them, she can move towards decolonization in a way. Not super fleshed out, but that's sort of what I was thinking about. I really liked Cassidy's question.
Yes, I want to invite Sarah to ask her question too, but before that, I'm curious, because I mean, it's interesting, right? The ending has a lot of ambivalence. It's kind of hard to figure out what's going on. And I think that it's sustainable to read her as getting her papers and then kind of moving into the US as, you know, a documented, legitimized citizen under the Suffolk state, right? But she also describes that moment as experiencing herself as being skinned, right? Which to me is a really not so positive version of that narrative, right? And so I'm curious about how that kind of jives with the way that you're thinking about the ending, Ames. And then I'll shut up and ask Sarah to kind of intervene. So.
No, that's a great question. And honestly, that was something that was giving me pause. Like I had a really hard time figuring out the ending, and this is eventually what I came up with. But like, I think that's a really great point and a great question that I'm not entirely certain about. I know, yeah. I don't have an answer. I'm gonna keep thinking about it though. If I think of one, let me get back to you.
No, that's okay. And you know, it's a tough novel, right? And it's a tough ending to think about. So, Sarah, do you want to ask your question? Go ahead, Jeff. Go ahead.
We get there, Sarah, because I think that a lot of our like responses to the ending are both, you know, wonderfully confusing in terms of whether I almost think that, you know, if Makina is in the United States at the end of the novel, I can't think of a more this version of if she's in the Big Chilango at the end of the book. I almost think that that's like a fate like worse than death for her. I kind of like the fact that this happens in this underground space in the border itself, and that there's a way in which we don't know where she ends up, that she's like in this liminal space when she's stripped of her name, her identity, you know, and given these other things which we are not given. I mean, there's a way in which I think it's very tempting to say, well, she gets her US paperwork, which, by the way, would therefore give her more license to actually make the very crossings that she, you know, couldn't have made, you know, before, that the papers will actually do that. But I just don't know that it happens on like in the space or in the dominant space. It happens in the liminal space instead. And that's why, you know, there's a way in which I think that, you know, there is an actual like rebirth almost. There's a, you know, that there's having not seen the movie, but maybe the creators of Soul are actually like doing some version of this, where, you know, Makina gets, you know, she definitely gets a new name. You know, how is she skinned and repositioned in all of this, but in this very, very liminal space. And this connects in some ways to David's question to Hannah about the future, I think, you know, like what is actually going on with that. Hannah, are you still here? I don't know whether she left or not, but there is that particular like question could like go forward in terms of what is all this, how does all this come together and point to a particular future?
I see that Hannah's still here if she wants to chime in on that point. Well, two quick observations that won't help us solve this problem, but we'll just add more complexity, which is kind of what we do. But it seems to me there's a literal reading of the ending, right? Because there are tunnels that traverse the underground of the US-Mexico border, and it could be that Makina is kind of descending into one of these realms and actually receiving papers and going up. But it also replicates the experience of her brother in a certain way, where he has to surrender his actual identity in order to be legitimized in the US. And so it's playing on that. I see Marianne has her hand up.
Yeah, I agree with what you were just saying about her brother, who, like, I feel like her brother was skinned, but I'm surprised to hear this idea that Makina was skinned, because I'm just thinking about this. She's such a strong character, like at every moment. I never feel her relinquishing her, like her authority, her autonomy, right? You know, when the guys on the bus want to mess with her, she just like practically breaks his finger. She just like deals with like the mob or whatever it is because she has to. And particularly at the end, when she, you know, writes what she writes, when the policemen have the guys on their knees, this is a woman who hasn't been skinned, I guess is my point. I didn't really see the novel heading there. I also didn't see her wanting, it's not like she wants to remain. At no point, it's not like she's had this like great experience that has sort of been like, oh, you know, this is really like a good place to be. So, yeah, it does kind of, I guess, it reads like punishment that she gets her papers and is sort of required to stay here. And I guess the reason that she has to stay is she's just been changed. She's been changed by her experience and seen, I think, a lot of suffering and change among her people. Yeah, I guess that's what I had to say.
James?
Yeah, I have two things, building off of what you just said, Professor Noble, and also Professor Middents, your comment that now that Makina has her papers, it's not that she has to stay in the US, it's just that it facilitates her travel back and forth much easier. So you're right that I don't necessarily see her like making her new life in the US, but acting and going back and forth more simply in a way like getting her papers lets her get around the settler state, even though she's moving through it. And then the other thing that I was thinking about, I read a critical piece where they were talking about, and I can't remember who it was by, but basically she was talking about how Makina, even back at the beginning, like is a door, and how she's constantly referred to as like she passes the message, but she doesn't, you know, intercede with them. So even though she demonstrates all this like agency, as you were talking about, Professor Noble, she also in many ways like is a conduit for other people. And so their reading of the ending was that her getting her papers and then her being skinned is her actual death of her as a person, where then she just becomes a conduit to help other people in her community to reach the same place where they can travel back and forth more easily. So that was that reading that I just thought was interesting and I think ties in well to our discussion.
Lily?
Thank you. And I love that conversation about her kind of turning into a conduit, like literally becoming the infrastructure, right? And I wonder to kind of, I hope this kind of can bridge to Sarah Marsh's question in the chat, is that I wonder the folks reading about the militarism in the novel, right? That a huge way in which, you know, both the brother and her get skinned is the compromises that they need to make in terms of being complicit in the settler colonial expansion of empire, right? I mean, warfare. So this goes into kind of Ames' point, right? That the book is both hyper local in terms of the US-Mexico border, but also gestures towards the violence and militarism and the skinning of people abroad. And this perhaps ties into Sarah Marsh's question about environmentalism, because a huge part of the stress we're putting on the environment now is due to military warfare, the nuclear testing in the Pacific Islands, the ongoing nuclear testing all around the world that's literally ruining our environment, the Pacific Ocean being the largest body of water on Earth, right? And this ongoingness. And, you know, I wonder if we could tie the question about militarism and Sarah's point about environmentalism together in this way.
Could I ask you to clarify something, Lily? What compromises do you see Makina making? Do you mean like delivering the packet, for example? Like working with the mob?
I mean, this is just alluding to, and I think the panelists can say more about this, right? The fact that, you know, the surrendering of her identity in order to be legible in terms of paper, access being gained through settler colonial terms, right? So
you're saying right in the very end, it's the compromise at the very end of like relinquishing, of taking those papers.
And the whole process, right? The whole journey itself was set on settler colonial claims. It is the very infrastructure and the barriers and the violence that, you know, the terrain, the border itself, right? Being an infrastructure that is created due to colonialism. And so, I mean, the whole history of the ways in which she has to surrender her body and her safety throughout the whole novel, right? And then leading to the quote unquote skinning of her at the end, and her brother, right? If we're even thinking about the gutting of kinship structures, right? That the family is torn apart. The family is literally torn apart in service of empire, right? Like for at least for the brother's case, we could read more complexity in terms of how she is navigating at the end. But I guess I just kind of want to ask this question between militarism and environmentalism, and then the ending itself, the skinning.
Well, let me jump in because I feel Marianne's resistance to Makina being really complicit in all of this, and in a way that's very different from the way in which her brother is. And this speaks to some extent also to Ames's points about the ending. It's not Ames's point, but Ames's point that she references about Makina being a door. And there's a way in which I really want to resist that, because I think that she is a conduit until the 8th section, where she's where she writes out, and I think it's pointed that she writes out like the sort of lists of the crimes, and that those crimes are not, I'm not even sure if they're articulated as crimes or not, but that those are that's where she takes ownership and agency of the, but not in being complicit with the settler colonialist ideal of this. This is in fact, and Lindsey's not here to like talk about dirty, pretty things, you know, but if we bring it back to that, there's the line that I quote from Dirty and Pretty Things in my class, which is like pretty much this entire paragraph condensed into like a line of dialogue, which is like, we are the people you don't see. We are the people who wash your clothes. We are the people who drive your cars. We are the people who suck your cocks. And there are ways in which that's what she's doing here, is that she's like, no, I'm going to articulate myself in this other way. And she doesn't even say it. It's actually, it's the cop that actually has to say it out loud and changes his way of speaking, you know, by the time, because he can't articulate his narrative over hers. And that's when she gets the papers almost immediately after that. But she doesn't ask for them. They're just sort of given to her. And that's where this gets really messy, because there, I think, Lily, is where, you know, so she does this and then she gets the papers, like with a reward that she didn't ask for and didn't want. So is that the point where this, because we don't see her reject the papers. We also don't see her given the opportunity to get the paper, to like reject the papers. And that may be its own, you know, issue with that. But I'm with Marianne. I don't want to, like, she is so strong so many times, like in reading this and in working with folks on this throughout, like this sort of thing. It's been so much fun to see how de-romanticized this book refuses to romanticize anything. And Makina herself is like so, you know, so like an unromantic character that I don't want her to give that up at the end. Maybe that's just me, like in my own, like I want her to have a particular, to be in a particular place. Anyway, yes.
She's a badass for sure. There's no question.
She's a badass.
Yeah, she is. She is. Sarah, we need to get to your question. I'm so sorry. We've been sidetracked.
Oh, that's okay. Let me try to tie this in, because I think Lily's point about militarism is really important as one of the ways in which empire is instrumentalized in the bodies of others. So Talia knows all about this from our class this semester. During the early modern period, when empire was really, I mean, arguably in its most sort of energized phases, there are a variety of conceptions of what property is. And the empire itself is possible through the imagination property claims in other parts of the world. Probably the earliest example is in 1455, the Romanus Pontifex issued by Nicholas V, right, which granted sort of these claims to the Portuguese king in other lands. And for a long time, the claims of empire were transacted in the name of the king, right? These were the king's overseas domains. And then, with the rise of the plantation system, there start to be claims in the land that are forged by companies like the Virginia Company, individual proprietors. There's the English headright system, right, that links the conscription of labor in the British Isles to the enslaved labor from Africa to the expropriation of indigenous lands, right, in the Western Atlantic, right? These systems become interlocked with one another. But the thing that's, I think, perhaps salient here is to think about two ways in which property is conceived of during this earlier frame, which is the idea that the property, right, this is a pencil, right, it's my property, right, it's the material object, but it's also the positive interest that I assert in the pencil, which prevents other people from using the pencil, right? So the property is both the thing itself and the abstract claim in the property. And what we've been talking about a lot, Talia, in our class is the ways in which people who were enslaved understood themselves to still be human beings and to still have claims in themselves and to still have real human lives, despite what these pieces of paper said, right? And so this raises a couple of questions in light of Makina's papers, right? One is, what's the epistemological status of paper in this particular context? How does that make us think about a novel as paper bound together that's causing us to think through these questions? And then on the other hand, Makina is a character, right? Characters in novels are not human beings, but they sure are like human beings. And so does Makina understand other kinds of claims in herself that are not reducible to property? And how do the papers change that or not as that relationship unfolds in the fiction? I'm gonna stop talking and let the panelists answer those questions.
Panelists?
Sorry, I said a lot. How about this? Does Makina understand herself? Like, what's the relationship Makina understands herself to have to herself? And do the papers change that relationship in any sense?
I mean, I'll jump in for a moment there to say that, there's, even if there is a change that happens to her when she loses, not only she doesn't just lose her name, she loses her language. Languages, all the languages, that all she has left is harchar, that's it. There's no, and she mentions she can't remember any other words in any other language, and so there is that loss, there is that change for it. And it is strange that it's the papers that, and infuriating. And as Marianne, I think, has pointed out, absurd that it's the papers that do that to her. And, that's also, it's distressing. I'm thinking also in terms of, Angel Rama's, concept of the lettered city. Angel Rama has this concept of the lettered city, and particularly that sort of colonial idea of how words, how paper, how all of those things, therefore makes, things real. But those things the idea of story almost even also articulates something and then covers up something else from a very colonialist, way of thinking. The only way in which we can understand Mexican codices is because they are translated by priests who are trying to, understand those either. But the codices, predate writing, you know, and there's the question of what do we do with that writing? And so it is distressing, you know, that the papers are what makes her disappear in some ways. Talia, go for it.
Yeah, so to Professor Marsh's question about how Makina sees herself, to go back to, I forget who initially brought up the part about her seeing herself as a door. I'm on page 18, and she has this little list of rules that she follows. You don't lift other people's petticoats. You don't stop to wonder about other people's business. You don't decide which messages to deliver and which to let rot. You are the door, not the one who walks through it. Those were the rules Makina abided by, and that was why she was respected in the village. And I think that she sees herself in terms of her utility to her community and her family. And when she takes on the new identity at the very end of the novel, I feel like she has a very straightforward mind, and she's just like, this is the next thing I have to do to be useful. Because I think, while I do think she has a lot of agency and a lot of personality, she doesn't seem very, like, with the whole thing with the boyfriend who wasn't her boyfriend, she doesn't seem very like self-centered or not self-centered. Most of what she does is not for herself, and she just sees herself in terms of what she can do for others, and this is just like the next thing that she can do.
You know, I'm reminded in this, like, Talia, the way that you articulated that is reminding me of a recent conversation we were having in my class. Apologies for bringing in another text from outside of this one, but I think, and a filmic one, but I think it's relevant here. The sort of what the extra textual things that happened with Cuarón's Roma, and how the actress who plays the central character in Roma, Yalitza Aparicio, was, you know, she was a school teacher and was kind of very meek and unassuming, and, you know, in some ways felt of herself as something like the character. And in the process of everything that happened with that movie and the international attention that came to it, and then the like very like clear racism involved when Mexican actresses actually said, oh, she's not actually acting. How dare she be nominated for an acting award, you know, from this. And the end of that particular process, Aparicio herself is like, no, actually, I'm going to become an actress now. And that is the way in which I'm going to teach, because that is another form of teaching. And it strikes me that that's, Talia, what you're talking about here, that Makina actually does this thing that's next. I am transformed. I am not what I was before, even though, you know, I stayed in this particular place. But now I'm forced into something new. But it might be better. This goes back to Hannah. Maybe this is the future. This might be better. All of a sudden, now I'm happy at the end with this. Talia, you just made this like work for me. So I'm uplifted now.
I see we're at time right now, and we should probably end in the interest of people attending other panels later in the day. But thank you, panelists, and all of our guests who showed up for a terrific conversation. It's just really wonderful. And panelists, I really want to congratulate you, because you got some very, very difficult questions and you handled them just beautifully. And it was really a wonderful thing to participate in. So thanks, everybody. And I will see you all around in person, hopefully soon.
Bravo, and join us for the rest of the day.
Bye-bye, everyone.